am currently holding a piece of impossible biological technology discovered after forensic AI revealed a second creature acting as a sentinel at the 1967 film site. My location is being pinged by the federal authorities because I finally uncovered the Department of Energy marker guarding the stable wormhole that Patty gave her existence to keep hidden. I have spent 3 decades staring at the same few hundred frames of celluloid, but I only recently realized that for 57 years, the world has been looking at a decoy. We have all scrutinized the Patterson-Gimlin film, the shaky holy grail of the natural world, but I knew 1967 technology had captured a truth the human eye was not equipped to translate. What I found proves we were not watching a lone animal. We were witnessing a high-stakes tactical maneuver never meant to be decoded. When I ran the original master through forensic artificial intelligence reserved for federal cold case surveillance, the shadows did not just sharpen. They moved independently of the creature, hinting at a restricted reality hidden in plain sight. Sitting in my studio at 3 in the morning, the only light comes from twin 32-inch monitors, casting a cold, digital blue over my hands as workstation fans whine. This is temporal stable interpolation, a process where software calculates exactly what happened in the trillionth of a second between frames. As the progress bar reached 90%, the grain of the 16mm film crystallized into terrifying clarity. Individual hairs on the creature's back caught the sunlight. But as I zoomed into the willow tangle 20 feet behind the subject, a second silhouette emerged. It was a smaller, matte black shape, perfectly still in the deep brush, revealing that Patty was not fleeing in terror. She was positioned in a protective arc between the camera and something far more vulnerable. I sat back, the air feeling thin, as I realized we spent half a century distracted by a decoy, while the real secret remained tucked in the background. I looked at the coordinates of that fallen cedar and knew I had to see if the earth still remembered the weight of what had been standing there. Frame 352 has been the subject of thousands of hours of debate. But when the artificial intelligence isolated the background pixel clusters, it revealed a heat signature ignored for decades. The creature was not walking away out of fear. She was leading the men away from a secondary presence in the ravine. This smaller, stationary shape possessed a density that did not match the foliage, casting a shadow with a rhythmic, biological tremor. I adjusted contrast filters, pushing the software to its limit to define that silhouette, driven to know what Patty was truly hiding. The artificial intelligence mapped the skeletal structure, highlighting a heavy brow and wide, intelligent eyes reflecting filtered light. This second entity remained motionless, watching Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin with a stillness that felt predatory and ancient. The realization hit like a physical weight. The famous film was not a chance encounter, but a recorded moment of a high-stakes maneuver. While the world argued over a costume, they missed a second observer that never stepped into the sunlight. I stared at the reconstructed facial features, noticing a scar across the bridge of its nose that matched terrain markers of the creek bed. I began to wonder if that second witness was still out there, deep in the inaccessible canyons of the Klamath Mountains. Using the upscaled landmarks, I mapped the topography of Bluff Creek against a modern light detection and ranging scan. The digital overlay revealed a subtle, geometric depression that should not exist in a natural drainage basin, a hollow tucked beneath 50 years of sediment. It was as if the ground had collapsed over an artificial cavity, a hidden pocket of the mountain invisible from the air. I cross-referenced coordinates with historical logging maps and found this tributary was omitted from every commercial survey between 1964 and 1972. As I plotted the points, I realized the film site was merely the threshold to a much larger, unexplored anomaly. The artificial intelligence flagged linear patterns leading toward the sinkhole, suggesting a pathing system used by something that understood how to avoid natural erosion lines. I began packing field gear, feeling the silence of the cabin as I prepared to step into the footprint of a cold case that had never truly passed away. The data suggested the creatures were not just passing through. They were guarding an entrance. Tomorrow, I leave the digital world behind to find what lies beneath that curtain of ancient ferns. The air in Bluff Creek does not carry the sound of birds or wind. Instead, it holds a low-frequency hum that vibrates in your molars. It is the sound of a forest trying to keep a secret, a heavy pressure suggesting the very oxygen is weighted with history. I stepped off the logging trail and into the undergrowth, a transition so abrupt it felt like crossing a border into a place where the modern world had been erased. The quiet was absolute, the zone of silence, where even insects hold their breath in anticipation of a predator that never reveals itself. As I navigated toward the coordinates, the topography shifted in ways the original film only hinted at. The ground became spongy, covered in moss that swallowed the sound of my boots. Yet every few hundred yards, I found evidence of something immense. Branches the size of my arm had been snapped upward, a feat requiring vertical force no bear could generate. I checked my handheld acoustic monitor, and the needles jumped into the red, capturing infrasonic pulses that triggered a primal flight response. I was standing less than 50 feet from the site where Patty made her famous turn. Yet the forest felt alien. Every shadow appeared to have a density that did not belong to the trees, and the hum in my jaw grew into a steady throb. I realized I was not alone, and the things watching me were not interested in being filmed. I reached the edge of the depression and found the sinkhole was actually a perfectly circular perimeter of scorched earth. I found a piece of obsidian-like glass embedded in a cedar tree at the exact height of the creature's head. When I wiped away the grit, I realized it was a biological lens, a crystalline structure with its own internal architecture. The object felt unnaturally warm, pulsing with energy that mirrored the low-frequency hum of the valley floor. It was lodged firmly in the bark, discarded or shed by something that no longer required its use. I used a specimen kit to extract the artifact, noticing the wood had grown in a spiraling defensive pattern. This was not a simple rock. Under my magnifying glass, the surface revealed a network of microscopic canals, resembling neural pathways. It suggested biological complexity that defies our understanding of evolution, a marriage of organic material and mineral durability. As I secured the lens, the atmospheric pressure shifted, and the silence grew even more oppressive. I looked back at the original film site, projecting the creature's path, and realized this lens was left where Patty had momentarily paused. It was a fragment of a witness, a piece of a biological machine watching the world for centuries. I began to wonder if the lens was a tool for sight, or a way for the forest to record those who dared to enter. I turned to leave, but my compass needle began to spin in a slow, clockwise circle, refusing to find north. My motion sensors did not go off, but my thermal camera lit up with 3 signatures circling my camp. They are not walking. They are gliding through the canopy at speeds no primate should achieve, moving with a fluid grace that defies the brush. The display shows 3 pillars of white heat against indigo, weaving between trunks without disturbing the silence of the night. I sat motionless in my tent, hand resting on my equipment case, listening to the rhythmic absence of sound. These entities are not merely observing. They are establishing a perimeter with military-grade coordination. The rangefinder showed the signatures exactly 45 feet away, maintaining an equilateral triangle around me, like I was a specimen being contained. The air grew heavy, with the scent of wet copper and ozone, a chemical sharpness signaling a powerful electromagnetic field. The infrared light began to flicker, the feed distorting as the figures drew closer to the canvas walls. I could hear soft, percussive clicking coming from the trees, a complex language vibrating into the base of my skull. It was clear my technological presence was no longer a secret, and the inhabitants were pushing back. I reached for my flashlight, but as my fingers brushed the switch, a massive, 5-fingered shadow pressed against the tent fabric, blocking the moonlight. The light detection and ranging map was correct, but seeing the anomaly in the flesh was like watching a ghost materialize. Behind a curtain of dripping ferns lies a narrow fissure in the basalt, a vertical doorway into a valley that has not appeared on a survey in over 100 years. I squeezed through the cold opening and emerged into a sanctuary that defied the laws of the wilderness. The temperature rose by 15 degrees, revealing a steaming microclimate where prehistoric flora thrived in winter. Giant horsetails crowded the banks of a thermal spring that smelled of sulfur and black earth. The hum was now a physical roar, a subterranean vibration emanating from the roots of the canyon. I could see paths carved through the emerald undergrowth, wide corridors clear of debris, suggesting land management no nomadic animal would undertake. The silence here was filled with the weight of unseen witnesses. I followed the primary trail toward the center of the depression, where thermal signatures had concentrated. As the mist parted, I saw the first signs of a settlement, but the structures were not made of wood or stone. The horizon was lined with shapes that looked like ribs, white and skeletal, reaching toward the sky. This is not a simple den. It is a complex architectural achievement. I stood before a spire of stacked elk rib cages and woven willow branches, mimicking the jagged geometry of the granite peaks. The bones were lashed together with a high tensile vine, knotted into intricate patterns, suggesting a symbolic culture beyond the capabilities of a mere animal. The air within this clearing smelled of cured leather and sweet incense burning in stone basins. These structures were arranged around a central obsidian slab, polished to a mirror-like finish, reflecting the swirling mist. I moved closer to the spire, noticing the bones were etched with fine microscopic grooves, not tool marks, but something like a biological script of passed-away ancestors. It was a cathedral of the wild built by hands that understood history and the necessity of awe. Standing in the center of a sentient civilization sent a chill through my bones. Every detail indicated a profound understanding of mathematics and acoustics. I reached out to touch the willow, but a low, guttural vibration rose from the ground, shaking the ribs of the spire. I turned toward the tree line and saw that shadows were no longer waiting for the night. They were detaching themselves from the trunks. I set my 4,000-pixel infrared rig to record, but the footage was being erased as it was recorded. Something in this valley is emitting a localized electromagnetic pulse, a targeted interference that renders sensors useless. My monitor dissolved into a rhythmic pattern of static pulsing, in time with the subterranean thrum. I watched in frustrated silence as sophisticated lenses became inoperative glass. The vulnerability of an investigator whose tools have been neutralized is absolute. Without the digital buffer, I was stripped back to basic human senses. My radiation meter pinned itself against the far right margin, indicating a surge of ionospheric energy that should not be possible. It felt as though the valley itself was a biological machine that recognized my gear as a foreign pathogen and was shutting it down. I realized my reliance on technology was a leash that led me into a trap. The shadows were now gaps in the static, voids where interference was so dense it warped the light. I knelt to check the hard drive, but the casing was too hot to touch, humming with a frantic vibration. I'm no longer the observer. I've become the variable in an experiment I do not understand, and the static is starting to whisper. I knelt to drink from a thermal spring and saw a reflection looking back that was not my own. It was old, scarred, and looked exactly like the reconstruction pulled from the 1967 film. The face in the water possessed an ancient symmetry, with eyes that held profound intelligence and a recognition that froze the breath in my lungs. There was no roar of aggression. There was only a silence so dense the world seemed to stop turning. The creature was standing less than 10 feet behind me, its presence so massive it displaced the air. Yet I had not heard a footfall. Its hair was silvered charcoal matted with clay, and its skin had the texture of weathered bark. We stayed locked in that visual bridge for what felt like hours, a moment where the boundary between disparate branches of evolution dissolved. I saw the same scar across the bridge of its nose, flagged by the software, a physical testament to a life spent hiding in the fringe. The creature slowly raised a hand the size of a shovel and placed it against a redwood trunk. It did not threaten. It was gauging my reaction with a calm gaze that felt almost parental. Then, with a fluid motion, it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I remained by the water, heart drumming, wondering if I had been granted a vision or warned of a threshold I should never have crossed. Deep in the valley, I found a rusted titanium survey spike with a Department of Energy serial number driven into a scorched granite shelf. They have been monitoring the biological leakage and electromagnetic anomalies for 40 years, long before I upscaled a single frame. The spike was cold, but the surrounding soil was sterile, a blackened circle where no ferns dared to root. This was proof the highest levels of government had mapped this canyon and designated it a classified zone. Beneath pine needles, I discovered a buried junction box, its lead shielding etched with warnings concerning high-frequency radiation. The mystery shifted from a search for a hidden primate to the realization that I was trespassing on a living laboratory, where nature and national security blurred. I felt paranoia at the back of my neck, realizing my every move might be tracked by sensors more sophisticated than my own. The marker suggested the creatures were not just protected, they were being contained or utilized as barometers for something far more dangerous. The hum in the air was not just the mountain, it was a massive, hidden infrastructure. I reached for my satellite phone, but the screen was non-functional, replaced by a single, blinking red light. Someone was finally pinging my location, and they were not coming from the forest. The Bigfoot howl is not a call, it is a structured language. When my recorder processed the echoes, it flagged a repeating linguistic pattern, following grammatical rules. Waves formed a fractal geometry of sound, and as the software reached its pass, I realized the creatures were speaking a name, and that name was mine. I stood frozen as my own name echoed back in a deep timbre that vibrated through my marrow. This was not simple mimicry. The cadence was deliberate, possessing an inflection of query, indicating they had been observing my history as closely as I had been observing theirs. The analysis revealed phonemes that do not exist in any human tongue, whistles layered beneath the bass that carried biological data about my height and heart rate. It was a sensory profile being broadcast across the canopy. The weight of being addressed by a legend turned my breath into gasps. The observer effect had been reversed. I was no longer a ghost. I was a catalogued entity. As the last echo passed away, the forest fell into a silence, as if waiting for my response. I reached for the recorder to save the file, but a high-pitched screech tore through the air, and the device dissolved into molten plastic in my hand. The rhythmic thump of a Black Hawk helicopter cut through the silence, like a blade. Federal authorities were not arriving for a rescue. They were coming to secure a site that ceased to exist the moment I stepped inside. The sound was the aggressive resonance of a military extraction team. Rotors beating against the mist until the canopy swayed in a mechanical wind. I scrambled toward the basalt fissure, mind racing through the protocols of a man who had become a liability to a 40-year-old secret. From the shadows, I watched unmarked shapes hover over the bone cathedral, deploying lines like black veins from the sky. Men moved with surgical precision, in tactical gear lacking insignia, their faces obscured by visors. They were not looking for a creature. They were heading for the obsidian slab and the markers I had uncovered. My presence had triggered a containment sequence, and the creatures were already vanishing into limestone caves, leaving me with the cleaners. I clutched the lead-lined container holding the biological lens, feeling the heat of the artifact as searchlights swept the floor. Soldiers were using thermal scanners that would find me in seconds, and the extraction was moving with practiced speed. I had to decide if my life was worth the evidence as a flashbang grenade detonated, blinding the forest in a chemical glare. I turned toward the cliffs, realizing the only way out was a path no human was meant to climb. I had to choose the main trail and the agents, or the vertical cliffs and the things in the mist. I chose the mist. The rock wall was a slick expanse of basalt, but as I reached for the first handhold, a low-frequency vibration humming through the stone guided my fingers toward hidden fissures. The ascent was a harrowing journey through a vertical labyrinth. Above, helicopters continued their sweep, searchlights cutting through vapor like scythes, yet they never illuminated the rock where I clung. It was as if the mist were thickening around me, a localized weather phenomenon acting as a shroud against infrared sensors. I looked up and saw a massive arm reach down from a ledge, not to pull me up, but to gesture toward a narrow chimney in the rock. They were herding me, using their knowledge of the terrain to navigate me through the blind spots of military surveillance. By the time I reached the upper plateau, my lungs were burning from thin air and the physical toll. I looked back and saw the valley floor swarming with figures, flares illuminating the bone cathedral in an artificial crimson. I had escaped the perimeter, but as I turned to face the vast expanse, I realized I was still being followed. The sound of rotors was fading, replaced by a single rhythmic footfall that matched the beating of my own heart. I made it back, with one corrupted, secure, digital card tucked into my jacket. When I forced the file open in the safety of my studio, the artificial intelligence revealed the truth about why they stay hidden. The software detected something in the light spectrum that surpassed terrestrial physics, a translucent veil indicating the hidden valley is not just a location, but a fold in the fabric of our reality. The final frame captured before the rig melted showed Patty standing next to a vertical pillar of light that did not cast a shadow. The artificial intelligence mapped the energy output as a stable wormhole, a localized gateway that explains how a population of 1,000-pound primates can vanish without a trace. I realized the Department of Energy was not monitoring a species. They were guarding a door to a place where the laws of existence and time do not apply. I sat in the blue light, an old man burdened by a secret that makes the Patterson film look like a footnote in a cosmic ledger. I keep my doors locked now, and I never go back into the forest without a radiation meter. The world may see the grain and pixels, but I see the gateway and the guardians who have been watching us since before we walked upright. The secret is out in the digital ether, but I know some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be feared. The cascades have a way of burying the truth under layers of mist and time, but some secrets are simply too heavy to stay hidden forever. If you are ready to venture further into these restricted shadows, subscribe and join our watch. The deeper we go, the more the forest begins to look back. Share this record with those who understand that the unknown is not a myth, but a reality waiting for the right light. Until then, keep your eyes on the tree line, because the guardians of the valley are still there, watching, and they never forget a face.